in pursuit of health and wisdom. Sapio with Buck Joffrey.
Welcome everyone to Sapio with Buck Joffrey, and today we are going to do something a little bit different. I am here with one of our producers, Ben Hyatt. Ben, how are you doing?
Great. So far, so good. So we'll see how the day goes.
That's good. Good. So, you know, we talked a little bit on the phone the other day, and I was kind of wrestling with how to do this podcast. And so basically, here's the deal. Is there's this concept I want to try to get across, and you know, it's about metabolic syndrome. But the issue, Ben, is that this is a concept that I think it's incredibly important, but it's pretty darn complicated too. You've had some time to, I think, absorb, you know, what I kind of some notes I sent over to you too. Yep. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, definitely. And I will have some questions for you for sure. I mean, what you sent was great, but it's complicated.
So basically what we decided to do for this episode was to say, okay, what I'm going to do is what I've done on a few different occasions. We've done some episodes where essentially it's just me kind of teaching, right? And telling you about a topic. We did the same thing with inflammaging, which I don't know if you happen to listen to that one, Ben, but it gets kind of complicated, right? And so what I wanted to do is make sure that in doing this, I try very hard to make it so that everybody's going to understand, or at least you're going to understand most of what there is. You know, since I have a medical degree, some of this language is very natural to me. And so, but at the same time, it's such an important topic. I was like, okay, I'm going to get Ben on here and I'll do the same thing, but I want you to interrupt me when things are getting complicated or when there are follow-up questions that you have on something. So, all right, so let's talk about it.
Sounds great.
All right.
Yeah.
And so everybody out there, here's the thing. Don't tune out. Because when you hear the words metabolic syndrome, man, that's a real sleeper, right? It doesn't sound very exciting like cancer or, you know, living to 120. But the thing is it turns out this phenomena that we're going to be talking about significantly increases virtually all causes of death, including cardiovascular disease and you know, all of the major causes, right? So first of all, the thing is that when I was digging into this, I was like, man, I don't ever remember learning anything about this in medical school. And, you know, at least this paradigm, you know, there are pieces of this that make up metabolic syndrome that certainly I learned about in medical school. But as it turns out, the reason for that was that the formal definition of this, or the first formal definition of this, really hadn't even come out until 1998. When, I was in medical school when that happened. And then it took a few years for the world to sort of, anytime any sort of new language comes up in the medical literature, you know, in order to become sort of part of the everyday parlance, it takes a while. And by that time I was a surgeon. Right. And when I was a surgeon, of course, you know, we didn't talk about this kind of stuff. We just cut people. Anyway, in a way, it's just a newer way to think about a disease. While I will say that even though that, you know, in 1998, it wasn't something I've stopped medical school and maybe it's more common now, I will say this much, is I still don't think it's something that a lot of physicians kind of think about in terms of this framework. I'm curious, Ben, have you ever, before working with me, have you ever heard the terminology metabolic syndrome?
I have not. So up until a week ago, I've heard metabolic, but not metabolics as a disease.
So here's the deal. 1 in 4 people in the world are estimated to have metabolic syndrome. So you definitely know someone who has it. You might have it yourself. You can, you know, you won't be alone if you do. But that's the point here. And it's one of the major killers out there. I mean, It just is. When you hear this, you're going to realize that. All right. So what I would suggest for anybody, including you, Ben, is get out a pen and start writing some of this stuff down. Okay. So metabolic syndrome, first and foremost, as I said, it's going to significantly increase the risk of virtually every other cause of death. And so let's start out with a definition of what it is. Okay. And basically there are various criteria. And if you have 3 of the following criteria, then you have metabolic syndrome. Okay. The first one is high blood pressure, which is defined, at least in terms of these criteria, as blood pressure of greater than 130 over 85. Now, luckily, I'm going to tell you where I'm standing with this stuff, and luckily, I think I'm lower than that. I'm usually lower than that. So I'm going to count that against me. How are you doing on that one, Ben?
I am lower than that. I generally have good blood pressure, but I do have a question on that.
Yeah.
So when I go to the doctor, I deliberately calm myself before he tests my blood pressure.
Yep.
So if I'm doing that, am I really giving a false reading? Because I'm not at all?
Nope.
Okay.
This is what your blood pressure is when you're at home and you're not stressed out.
Okay.
Okay. So you're right though. I mean, you don't want to. Now, granted, if most of the time your state was that of when you're in the doctor's office, then you know it is what it is. But if you can calm yourself down and you're below 138 over 85, then you don't meet this criteria. I'll just take this moment just again, just for educational purpose to say, well, why do you get high blood pressure in the first place? It happens when the force of the blood pushing against the walls of blood vessels is too high. I mean, it's literally blood pressure. And that's happening because your arteries have extra resistance pumping through your body. And it can happen from narrowing or stiffening of blood vessels. And then the problem is that the higher blood pressures can damage the little blood vessels of organs like the kidneys and the eyes. You get people with retinal disease and even potentially blindness, that kind of thing from high blood pressure. So
diabetes, does diabetes cause high blood pressure, or is
diabetes certainly? Well, that's a very good question. So this is what I would say is that metabolic syndrome is a continuum that ultimately leads to this diabetes, right?
Okay.
So diabetes is like if you have type 2 diabetes, you definitely have metabolic syndrome, right?
Okay. That's good.
So that's what I would say. So that was the first criteria. The second criteria, and remember, you need 3 of 5 of these. And I don't know if you know the answer to this one, Ben. Your triglycerides. Okay, triglycerides are basically the fat that's floating around in your blood. It's kind of gross. Right. You can think about little chunky pieces of fat. And if your triglycerides are over 150, that's a check mark against you. So mine is 54, and so I'm okay there. Ben, do you know what your triglycerides are?
I do not know, but you should know, right? This is something you should know.
It's a good question, right? Like the truth of the matter is that, well, we always talk about cholesterol. So most people know about their cholesterol, but you ought to know about your triglycerides as well. That's not something that everybody thinks about, but you should know what your triglycerides are. And
is it part of a standard?
When you get your lipid panel, it should give you your triglycerides too. But it's one of those things that I feel like unless it's, really high, no one brings it up. But here's the thing is that like we're saying over 150, but what if yours was 130? I mean, maybe it's quote unquote normal, but I would work on it, right? I would be alarmed by that and say, gosh, I should try to get that below 100, if at least.
So did you say you're at 54?
Yeah, and you're going to see my numbers are kind of abnormally good, and it's because I do some pharmacological manipulation there too. So I'm not going to take it as I'm not. I'll admit that I know I'm doing this thing. I'm doing a lot of these things to myself on purpose for this reason. So
you're keeping your triglycerides low.
All my lipids are kind of artificially really optimized. So,
which is good for the heart, right?
Well, again, the reason for me doing that is that I am of the opinion that no one should die of cardiovascular disease if you don't already have cardiovascular disease, given the ways that we have to prevent cardiovascular disease and even treat it if you catch it early. So, the next criteria. And so again, the last one was triglycerides over 150. The next one is HDL less than 40 in men or less than 50 in women. Mine is 59, I believe. So I'm good there. Do you know anything about your HDL?
Yours was 59?
Yeah.
But you said less than 40?
Less than 40 is bad because this is good cholesterol.
It's bad. Oh, this is the good cholesterol. Yeah. All I know is that I was good. I need to go back to my doctor and get a new blood panel for this year because I didn't actually do it last year, which is after all our conversations. But I've always been okay. I eat a lot of avocados. Does that help? Okay,
avocados good. I mean, avocados is the good fat, right? It's the good fat, the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So. Okay, so far so good. Central adiposity. Okay, now this is an interesting one. It's your waist, central adiposity. It's such a polite way of saying fat, right? So a 40-inch waist in men or a 35-inch waist in women. Mine is actually 34. So I'm proud to say I'm 34.
So that's good. So I think I'm a 33, 34, depending on the pants.
Now I will say this. I think this one's kind of, I don't know. This one I think kind of lets a lot of people off the hook. Okay. Because if you're, if a guy's 5'6" and has a 38-inch waist, that means something very, very different than a guy like who's 6'4" like me. And who would have a 38-inch waist, right?
Yeah.
But again, I think these are using broad strokes. Yep. And if you have a 40-inch waist, you're a man, 35 in women, then you get a demerit for that one. All right. And then finally, the last one is a fasting glucose of greater than 110. Elevated fasting glucose, is obviously that's something that's suggestive of poor glucose metabolism. And so that's that. Actually, it's kind of generous since we usually want it to be 100 or below. But
so what is yours? Do you know what yours is?
Yeah, mine, it's interesting. In the morning, I'm right about 100. How about you?
I don't know the answer to this, but I have been tested for it and I was fine because I was worried because I was overweight that I might be pre-diabetic or I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
So I was fine.
Okay.
But, so you said in the morning it's high.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think for me, it has a lot to do with my morning sort of natural rhythms because actually I will say this is that, I frequently get this morning glucose and it might be fasting glucose and it might be like 101 and stuff. And for a while that was kind of like, it was a little freaking me out. But again, we have a measure of like what your glucose actually is. It like in real is sort of the average of what it is for the last 3 months. And that's a hemoglobin A1C.
Okay.
Right. So my A1C is 4.9, which is great because the target for that, I think a lot of longevity folks will tell you is about 5.2 or less, because that is indicative of 5.2 is indicative of approximately average blood sugar of about 100 and like maybe between 100 and 110. So if you're below that on there or on average below that, you're in great shape. Now, generally, there's this continuum. I mean, I think pre-diabetic starts at 5.9 and 6.5 is, diabetes. So the thing is here again, I think if you're looking at this, I think, you can certainly use a hemoglobin A1C here instead. So if your numbers are probably good, then probably
Do you think the A1C is more accurate than than the fasting?
I don't want to break apart the reasoning, but I would think so. I would think the A1C would be a better measure, because then you're looking at but I'm thinking that they're probably assuming that not everybody's getting a hemoglobin A1C, right? So
is this the test where they make you drink something really sweet?
No. This is just like, you wake up and you go and you haven't eaten or drank anything. You get, your blood tested. That's fasting glucose. Yeah. And to your question, why I think mine is high, I also told you that for whatever reason, like when I go in the sauna in the morning, I get a spike too. So I think there's just something about my personal physiology that makes me more likely to have a little bit higher glucose in the morning. And it is what it is. Yeah. Not worried because of the A1C is fine. So, so people who are listening out there, how'd you do? Okay. Well, don't freak out if you have metabolic syndrome, because again, 1 in 4 people in the world are estimated to have it. The good news is that this stuff is very, very reversible unless you've already got one of these really bad diseases that it can lead to. So I guess the question is, what's exactly happening with this syndrome? I mean, actually, sometimes it's, you get these lab abnormalities. And what I wanted to do is really try to explain what's going on. What is this constellation of things? Ultimately, what we're seeing here is what happens when more calories go in than we need, and that we are essentially sort of overnourishing ourselves. It's it's more complicated than that, but let's just say you eat something not good for you, and you stuffed yourself with a bunch of dessert, and what now? Those calories have to go somewhere, right? Their destination is essentially you are going to actually probably burn some of them off pretty quickly by utilizing those simple sugars. The sugars will get stored in the rest of it's going to get stored into muscle. It's going to get stored in the liver, or it will ultimately end up as fat. Okay. Now, once you're an adult, here's something that you may not know, which is interesting. Fat cells don't multiply. You don't get more fat cells.
Oh.
Yeah. They are there, and they just get bigger and smaller. So in kids, there is sometimes you have multiplying of fat cells, and that's called hyperplastic obesity. It's not something you see in adults. It's generally you're born with a certain fat pattern. Okay. Some people carry more of this fat, what we call subcutaneously. Now, what does that mean? It means that it's the fat that's literally under the skin. It's right under the skin. I am very familiar with that because I used to do a lot of liposuction, an enormous amount of liposuction cases.
Yep.
Liposuction treats the fat that's right under the skin, and that is the stuff that you can really see, right? It is like it looks. It's the stuff that kind of makes you look fat, right? So that's subcutaneous fat. Now, the other kind of fat that we have is deeper, and that's called visceral fat. That's the stuff that you can't pinch. Now, here's the thing. How do you know that you got visceral fat? Say you got a beer belly and you can't really pinch, then you got a lot of visceral fat.
Okay. I definitely have some visceral fat.
You've got visceral fat.
Yeah.
You do.
And so I have one quick question while you were mentioning the liposuction.
Yep.
So you said that you have the same number of fat cells.
Right.
But when you do liposuction, you're removing those cells, right?
Correct.
So those cells don't come back. Is that
That's right.
thing?
That's right.
Okay. That's interesting.
And it's interesting because the energy that needs to get stored somewhere. And so here's something you may find interesting. So what happens, Ben, is that, and this is a really important point. Remind me to come back to it because we're going to talk about the differences in those fat. And so if you reduce one, what really happens? But generally what will happen is, so I used to always treat liposuction as reshaping, right? I used to tell my patients that, okay, what we're doing here is we're giving you a new shape, right? You have certain shape. Some people carry this fat in, their hips or, their belly, or some people carry it in their thighs. And what we're going to do is we're going to just remove that fat. And so then the idea is the remaining fat that you have gets bigger and smaller together. And so you maintain a certain size or shape, I should say, not a size.
Yeah.
Your size goes up and down, but your shape should sort of, for the most part, stay the same, right? So that's actually, if you're talking about from an aesthetic standpoint, that's the person who liposuction is actually really good for, is the person who's disproportionate. Liposuction is not for weight loss, right?
Interesting.
It is completely for changing the shape of a person. Okay. So, and it does wonders aesthetically for some people. I mean, you see some people, like if you see someone like a woman who, is totally thin and all of a sudden carries a lot of fat right around their hips or something. Well, you can make a huge aesthetic difference for somebody like that. So, anyway, as we continue to consume more calories than we need, those storages of fat, wherever they are, they get filled up. And if it's subcutaneous fat, again, it looks bad, and that's why people get liposuction. But subcutaneous fat, paradoxically, is actually, it's helping you because it's basically a reservoir for all of these calories, for storage of these calories. And so why do we have that? I mean, if you were a caveman, Ben, and there wasn't as much a bunch of food in the winter, and you were, and you lived in Canada where you're from. Yep. You might starve to death before the person who had less subcutaneous fat, right? Because you have all these storages that you can use up in times of need. Now, here's the problem, right? Is there's this other kind of fat, visceral fat, and this is the first bad news for you, Ben, because you got a little bit of that. The stuff that
I do.
It's the stuff that's inside by your organs, and that stuff is bad because when it gets bigger, here's what happens. Unlike subcutaneous fat that just sits there and kind of looks bad, this stuff actually starts secreting nasty inflammatory chemicals called cytokines. Essentially, what's happening is that you've got these inflammatory chemicals sitting there right by your organs, and you can get that stuff by your intestines, by, all of the
liver,
all that stuff. And then you can also get it by your pancreas. You can get it by your heart. And increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, the pancreas, to make all this stuff even worse. So that's visceral fat. Now,
does it create any pressure on organs and stuff like that too? Like, is it squeezing organs, or?
I don't know if it's physically squeezing stuff as much as it is just creating, like, just imagine you've got the stuff that's kind of squirting stuff that's creating inflammation right by your organs, right?
Okay. Wow.
And prolonged inflammation, we've talked about that several times, is like we did a whole show on inflammaging, right?
Yeah.
So now as this fat accumulates, again, it starts going into, you've got this fat because you are, you're taking in more calories than you're using up and that you need. It needs to go to other places as well. So that's where the triglycerides came in. We talked about triglycerides as being one of the things we're looking at. You see it in blood, right? You see it in muscle. So imagine the marbling on a good steak. It's good on a steak. It's not good on you. Okay.
Right.
You also get it, I guess, as I mentioned before, in the heart, liver. And there's some evidence that I should point out that, going back to that issue of the marbling steak, that might be the first start, the trigger of where insulin resistance begins. Okay, so insulin resistance, as you recall, is what we're trying to avoid, because what insulin does is it pulls out the high blood sugar, which we know is, we've called it slime. It slimes everything, and it's really bad for you to have high blood sugar. Insulin is the hormone that's released from the pancreas that gets that sugar out of the bloodstream into the blood cells. Now, here's what happens in insulin resistance. It's literally what it sounds like. You need more insulin to do the same job. And ultimately, if you need too much of that, that becomes diabetes. That is type 2 diabetes, essentially. So insulin resistance is sort of this trigger that happens, and it probably starts when this stuff starts going in the muscles because of various mechanisms that get screwed up from fat in the muscle. Okay? So there's that. Now that creates this vicious cycle because, as we said, the insulin is not working effectively. It's not working as easily as it should to bring that blood sugar down, and that makes the pancreas, where the insulin comes from in the first place, release even more insulin. So now you get, hyperinsulinemia, which is a fancy way of saying, there's this unusually high amount of insulin out in the bloodstream. Now, other than sugar metabolism, insulin has other effects too. So now you're cranking up the insulin, and the other effects include more fat deposition. Okay?
Right.
And then the pancreas itself starts getting fat around it, and that creates trouble because the pancreas starts sort of getting fatigued,
Right.
So this
question, I have a question.
Yeah.
So so I don't know if I've ever heard it quite explained like that. So producing more insulin, obviously the pancreas has to work harder,
right?
But that actually causes more fat.
No. What's happening is because you've got this fat deposition going on at the organs, and it's releasing. So then the pancreas is getting more. You're getting more and more insulin resistance, right? So the pancreas starts releasing even more insulin.
Okay.
That causes more fat deposition, and part of that fat deposition is going to happen on the pancreas itself.
Okay. Yeah. Which again releases toxins into the inflammation into the pancreas. Okay.
Right.
Wow.
So you've got this initial reaction, which is ultimately excess calories, and this path ultimately toward metabolic syndrome, which is hyperinsulinemia, which is high insulin, and of course insulin resistance. Okay, our body's becoming less sensitive and starts to screw up blood sugar regulation. So that's where we're at with that now.
Right.
And that again results in increased fat production and deposition, right? Because again, you've got these high insulin. And so that causes a change in that lipid profile that we talked about, which was high triglycerides, bad cholesterol good cholesterol, the HDL, goes down. LDL cholesterol goes up.
Oh,
right.
So it actually goes, why does it go down? Is there a thought on why it goes down?
That's a good question. I mean, not entirely sure on the specific mechanism of HDL going down because of this, but I think it's just an overall change in lipid profile from good to bad, right?
Okay.
But again, remember HDL cholesterol, that was one of the criteria as well.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's now going down because of this.
Right.
Okay, so there's that. Now, we talked about another criteria was high blood pressure. And we see high blood pressure in metabolic syndrome from a number of mechanisms, including, as I mentioned, high insulin. The other thing that insulin can do is it can cause sodium retention. And when you retain salt, sodium is salt, right? Yeah. Water follows it. So if you just imagine, like, if you ever have like something super salty and stuff like that,
you're thirsty.
You get thirsty, right? And then sometimes, I don't know, some people even get swollen from it. So that's really what that is, right? And that causes an expansion of fluid into the blood vessels. So that's one way of getting high blood pressure from that. Triglycerides in the bloodstream can cause inflammation, blood vessel dysfunction, another way to get high blood pressure. There's a number of, the high blood pressure part of this is really complicated, and I'll just say that there's a number of reasons you get higher blood pressure. But again, that's why that's one of the criteria for metabolic syndrome. Okay,
and high blood pressure obviously does a lot of damage.
Oh, end organ damage there. too, because now you've got, you increase your risk for cardiovascular disease and stroke, you're damaging blood vessels, dementias, any number of things. Again, it's just this vicious cycle. Okay, so let's move on to that point, right? So all of this stuff we talked about, this situation that's going on, this thing that is called metabolic syndrome, and essentially it's like this, gradual overflow of calories that's sort of consuming and trying to find a place in your body, and ultimately it's this process that starts giving you disease, right? So you mentioned, for example, with high blood pressure, we're getting, your increased risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke. We talked about vision problems with retinas, kidneys. There's problems with your kidneys. Those inflammatory chemicals coming from the visceral fat that we talked about, they're going to increase your risk for cardiovascular disease. They're going to increase your risk for cancer. And we also get accumulation of fat in the liver. Now, this is something that is a massively big problem that's continuing to become bigger and bigger. So it's fatty liver disease, right? So that's something that we need to be checking liver enzymes for too. I'm surprised actually that the liver enzymes were not part of that criteria, because it's a big thing. So in the problem with the liver situation is essentially you start out with this fat that accumulates in the liver, and that is that's a fatty liver, and eventually that fat, because of the cytokines that it releases, starts to create inflammation, and inflammation of the liver generically is known as hepatitis. Okay. This is a specific kind of hepatitis. It's non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. It's called NASH. Okay. Now you may think, well, gosh, how common is that? Yeah. But as it turns out, as of 2025, it's projected to be the leading cause of liver transplant. Wow. So it is a big problem, and it's getting worse.
So the liver is cleaning your blood. Is that what it does?
Liver does so much. Much. I mean, you can even. I mean, it is the most miraculous organ, outside of the brain and the body. Okay. Right? It is. So you're doing a lot in terms of metabolism of storages of sugar. You are processing your cholesterol. So it's a big problem. You cannot live without your liver. So on the other hand, I will say what's interesting about the liver is it's also the most regenerative organ that we have. I mean, if you give away part of your liver to somebody for transplant purposes or whatever, and you're healthy, it's gonna probably grow back completely normal. It's an incredible organ. And of course, beyond that, so now we've got liver cirrhosis and all that kind of stuff, which is a horrible way to die, by the way. Right. And of course, all of this is as we talked about before, is this continuum of insulin resistance, and high insulin levels, of course, lead you down to the path of type 2 diabetes, which is essentially really bad insulin resistance. So, and as we previously talked about, diabetes is probably, as a disease, is the most underappreciated killer there is out there. It increases your risk for virtually every other kind of disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's disease. So, and that is effectively metabolic syndrome. I'm wondering, so questions on this, because this is, first of all, do you get it?
I do get it. I mean, it like you said, it's a lot. I do have some questions. Yeah. So are you saying that metabolic syndrome leads to diabetes, or are they one and the same? Like, once you have diabetes, you still have metabolic syndrome? Yeah.
I mean, basically I would think of metabolic syndrome as like diabetes, type 2 diabetes is basically on the continuum of that, right? And ultimately you're culminating with this extreme insulin resistance. So yeah, I would say that's the way I would call it.
Okay. So questions on that. Now that you've got diabetes, why do people who have diabetes take insulin? Is it the pancreas? So the body needs to produce more and more insulin. Pancreas can't keep up. So then they have to inject insulin?
So here's a distinction that is important. There's type 1 diabetes and there's type 2 diabetes. Okay. So type 1 diabetes is the stuff that sometimes you get in kids. And basically what happens there, it's like an autoimmune situation where the pancreas, the islet cells start, for whatever reason, getting destroyed and they stop releasing insulin. So that's not metabolic syndrome per se. That is a autoimmune disease. And those are the situations where you start adding insulin to the regimen. Okay. Now type 2 diabetes, usually you don't use insulin. Okay. In super extreme situations you might, but usually what you're doing there is you're giving various drugs that are effectively increasing the insulin sensitivity and that kind of thing. So
this is like I have a family member that's type 2 and he's on metformin.
Yep.
Right. Is one of the ones.
Yep.
And it's something kind of controllable, but you don't want to because there's been people that have come back from type 2, right?
Oh, it's reversible.
It's reversible.
Yeah. I mean, most type 2 diabetes, I think I would put in the reversible space. Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's not easy. You're right. Okay. But I do think that it is something that people can, they can't. So here's an interesting thing to think about, right? And we talked about fat. Where that fat is and how much fat there is actually really important, right? Because again, you would think that having a lot of subcutaneous fat, like that makes you look fat. Yeah. It would be a bad thing. But if you have a bunch of extra calories, that's really where you want it to go. Right. If you have actually less fat, then you're essentially you have less reservoir for that. Right. Right. So you can, you've heard the term skinny fat. Yeah. Yeah. Right. That's kind of like where somebody doesn't have a lot of fat cells. Yeah. But the stuff around their organs is just kind of filling up. It's maxed out.
How do they test for this? Like, is there?
Yeah, you can get a
as far as the fat.
There's something called a DEXA scan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So DEXA scan. Okay. Yeah, you can use that to test it. So it's probably worth getting.
It'll tell you.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay. And then as far as, is there anything that you can do to get rid of the visceral fat? Like what are...
No procedures or anything like that. It's just basically, that's the whole regimen, right? That we've talked about with diet, exercise, and certainly pharmaceuticals can play a big role here.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So basically this is not good. It's something you want to watch for. So I'll have my checkup probably in the next month or so. So I need to be looking at all these numbers. Basically, right.
Yeah. You should come back and, you should, I mean, you don't have to tell everybody about it, but I think you should go back to this podcast at least and, and review your labs because again, to your point about like the difference between type 2 diabetes and this, like, again, we've used hemoglobin A1C. We've talked about that quite a bit, right? Yeah. And where I would say that, I think in the longevity community, I think most of us would say that you want a hemoglobin A1C, you target it at 5.2 if you can do it, right? That would be ideal. But again, we're in that scenario, you're really just looking at one, one variable that is starting to go awry. And if you look at metabolic syndrome as a more global way of looking at what's going on in your health, it actually gives you more warning. You know what I mean? Right. So,
well, and I will say that I didn't know about this before you sent over the notes.
Yeah.
And then the conversation, you've clarified a lot. I think the most important thing for me is I've always understood, recently anyways, that there is visceral fat and it's not good for your organs and stuff. But I assumed because it was, squishing your organs.
Yeah.
So hearing the toxins and, the inflammation and all that kind of stuff is new to me. And that makes it really, really important to actually, start doing something about it, I think.
There's another thing I would probably add, see if your doctor can add, which would be high sensitivity CRP, HSCRP.
Okay.
Because that's a really good systemic measure of inflammation.
Okay.
And you want to be you want to be in the normal range for that, for sure.
Okay.
Because
what
again,
I'll do?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No.
I'll go do this. Sorry, I'm shaking the computer.
Yeah.
I'll go get my blood tests because I'm about due for them anyways. And I think it's something I'm fine talking about it. I know that I've got some work to do.
Yeah.
And if it's helpful to someone else, it's a good thing. So
sure.
I'll get that checked.
Yeah, make sure they do. I would say make sure you get, fasting lipids. You want to make sure they do hemoglobin A1C. You want to make sure you get liver function enzymes. See if they can, as I mentioned, make sure they get a high sensitive CRP.
A1C, obviously.
A1C, triglycerides. Got it. That's in your. That'll be part
standard
of your lipid profile. So.
Okay.
But just tell them to test everything. Say you want everything,
Okay. And you and Alan did have done this, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm doing it fairly frequently actually. So,
right.
Okay. And anyway, I think this is this one other thing that I think is really interesting, Ben, just from the perspective of what I used to do. So I used to do a lot of liposuction, right? I mean, I've probably done 3,000-4,000 liposuction cases. I mean, wow. I was a fat sucking machine,
And it literally is a vacuum. You're vacuuming it out. Is that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, with some, with some friction and stuff. But the thing that it occurs to me that when people are removing subcutaneous fat, even though something that might make you look good could actually be worse for your health, right? Because remember, the excess fat has to go somewhere. And so if you're getting liposuction and you're getting all this subcutaneous fat sucked off, you're going to look better. But the problem is if you continue with excess calories, you are going to end up with visceral fat enlargement. And that's going to be really bad for you. Now, women, I should point out the other thing that's really interesting about this is that, and this was a lot of women thought this was of great benefit too, was that because women have breasts, fat tissue in the breasts often got bigger. So that was an effect that, a lot of women actually were happy about, where they would lose fat, say on their hips, and all of a sudden their chest got bigger. But
interesting.
Most men don't have that.
Or want that,
or want that, or that issue. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about having liposuction. There is a negative side of that for your health as well. And I'm certainly not judging. I mean, I've done thousands of these cases, so I get it. But it's something to keep in mind, especially people who go back for like repeat liposuction and all that stuff. Really, what it is at some point you just gotta keep your weight down, and that's really. That's
watch what you eat, processed food.
Yep.
Look at preventative stuff, which we've talked about. One quick question. It's a little outside the scope, but it's related to what you're talking about. So what about when people get fat injections? Because I know that happens with older people, the faces get hollowed out and they want to. So does that add new fat cells to your body? Or?
Well, they're usually getting that from themselves, right? So the way we typically do that is, so for example, you might suck out fat from somebody's belly or from their hips or whatever, and then at the same time take that fat and put it somewhere else. So effectively what you're doing, even, like the Brazilian butt lift, that's what that is, right?
Is it?
Yeah, that's what it is. So in that situation, what you're doing is you're removing subcutaneous fat from one place to another. So and you're not really necessarily changing. Functionally, you're going to reduce the amount of subcutaneous fat because you don't use all that fat, but the stuff that you're replacing, it's not a bad thing. So,
okay. Interesting. No, I think this is great. And it's a new year. So I was already planning on taking care of this. We went on a hike last week and I'll do more of that. So
yeah. Fantastic. Don't bring your dogs as an excuse next time.
Yeah, exactly.
Ben's slow because he's taking care of the dog.
Yeah, exactly. Someone has to. Yeah.
All right. Well, Ben, thanks for joining me. And if you would like to come on and review your labs, I think it would be interesting, and we get to another conversation like this.
Sounds perfect.
That's it for this week on Sapio with Buck Joffrey. I am Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thanks for listening to Sapio with Buck Joffrey. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe. Until next time, this is Buck Joffrey for Sapio with Buck Joffrey.